The golden light of dusk painted the California hills as Jackson Cole stared down at the claim he'd spent 2 years working. The vein of gold finally exposed worth more money than he'd ever dreamed of. And yet, his mind was fixed on a pair of deep brown eyes that had looked at him with disappointment when he'd announced he couldn't leave. The eyes of Daisy Miller, the schoolteacher who had stolen his heart without a single nugget of gold to her name. Jackson wiped the sweat from his brow, his calloused hands stained with the red earth of gold country. It was 1852, and the California gold rush was still in full swing, men arriving daily with dreams of striking it rich. And here he was, with that very dream realized, feeling empty inside. He'd come to California in '49 like thousands of others, chasing fortune after leaving his family's struggling ranch in Texas. Now, at 26, he'd found what he was looking for but lost what he hadn't known he needed. "You're a damned fool, Cole," he muttered to himself, shoveling dirt back into the hole that contained his fortune. His partner Thomas watched in disbelief from the entrance of their small, crude cabin. "Have you gone mad?" Thomas called, dropping the supplies he'd just brought back from Sacramento. "What in God's name are you doing?" Jackson didn't look up as he continued to fill the hole. "Covering it up, I'm leaving." Thomas rushed over, grabbing Jackson's arm. "Leaving? We just hit the biggest vein we've seen." This could set us up for life. Jackson finally stopped, looking at his friend of 3 years. "I know, and you can have my share." "What's gotten into you?" Thomas released his grip, bewilderment plain on his sun-weathered face. "She's leaving tomorrow," Jackson said simply. Heading back east on the morning stage, understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. The schoolteacher, the one with the smile that lights up the valley. Jackson nodded, remembering how Daisy had arrived in their mining settlement of Riverview last year to teach the children of miners and shopkeepers. She'd built the school herself with help from the townsfolk, brought books from San Francisco, and created something beautiful in a place dominated by men's desperate ambitions. "She asked me to go with her," Jackson admitted. "Said there was nothing left for her here now that they've found a permanent teacher. Said she was going home to Boston, asked if I might consider a different future." "And you told her no," Thomas guessed, "because of the claim." Jackson nodded, the memory of their conversation 2 days ago still raw. The hurt in her eyes when he'd explained that he couldn't abandon what might be his one shot at wealth. How she'd nodded with dignified understanding and wished him well. "I've been a fool, Thomas. Gold doesn't smile at you in the morning. It doesn't laugh at your terrible jokes. It doesn't teach children to read or bring flowers to sick miners." He picked up his hat from the ground and dusted it off. "I've spent 3 years digging in dirt, and all I've found is that I don't want what I thought I wanted." Thomas looked at the partially covered hole, then back at his friend. "You love her that much, enough to leave this behind," Jackson gestured to the claim. "Will you take it, all of it?" "You've earned it as much as I have." Thomas was silent for a long moment before extending his hand. "If you're sure, then I accept, but don't come crying back when you're poor and married with 6 children. Jackson laughed, taking his friend's hand in a firm shake. 6 might be ambitious. "What will you do in Boston? There ain't much call for gold miners in those parts." "I was a rancher before I was a miner," Jackson said, "and I can build, I can work, I'll figure it out." He moved quickly after that, gathering his few possessions, some clothes, his father's pocket watch, a small pouch of gold dust he'd saved, and the book Daisy had given him months ago when she'd taught him to read better. The rest he left behind. "The stage doesn't leave until morning," Thomas reminded him as Jackson mounted his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Buck. "I've got something to do first," Jackson replied. "A man doesn't show up empty-handed to ask a woman to marry him." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. "Marry." "You're that certain?" Jackson smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "The only thing I've ever been more certain of was that there was gold in that hill, and between the two, she's the real treasure." He rode hard into Riverview as the last light faded from the sky, the small settlement quiet except for the saloon on the far end of the main street. The general store was closed, but Jackson knew where Mr. Gunderson lived and pounded on his door until the shopkeeper appeared in his nightclothes. sputtering with indignation until Jackson explained what he needed and offered double the price. 15 minutes later, with his purchase secure, Jackson rode to the small boarding house where Daisy had taken a room when she first arrived. Mrs. Wilson, the owner, frowned deeply when she saw him at the door. "It's nearly 9 o'clock, Mr. Cole," she said sternly. "Hardly an appropriate time for a social call." "I understand, madam, but it's urgent. Could you please tell Miss Miller that Jackson Cole needs to speak with her, just for a moment?" Mrs. Wilson's frown deepened. "Miss Miller was quite upset today. I assume you know why." Jackson nodded, feeling shame burn in his chest. "That's why I'm here, to make it right." The older woman studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Wait in the parlor and keep your voice down. I have other boarders." Jackson removed his hat and waited in the small, tidy parlor, his heart hammering against his ribs. What if she refused to see him? What if she'd already decided he wasn't worth the heartache? He heard her footsteps before he saw her light and measured, just like her teaching cadence. Then she was there, standing in the doorway in a simple blue dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual neat bun. Her eyes were slightly red, and the sight sent a pang through his chest. "Jackson," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" He stood quickly, twisting his hat in his hands. "I came to tell you I was wrong and to ask if your invitation still stands." Confusion crossed her face. "My invitation? To go with you, to Boston, or anywhere else you want to go." He took a step toward her. "I hit the vein today, Daisy." "The big one, the one that would make me rich." Her expression fell slightly. "Congratulations, I'm happy for you." "I covered it back up," he said quietly. "Gave my share to Thomas." Her eyes widened. "You what?" "But you've worked for years. And in all those years, the happiest I've been was sitting on your school steps, listening to you read to the children, or walking you home after the town socials, or just seeing your smile when I bring you wildflowers." He took another step closer. "I don't want gold, Daisy. I want a life that means something, with you if you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes. "Jackson, do you know what you're saying, what you're giving up?" "I know exactly what I'd be giving up if I let you leave tomorrow without me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple gold band. "I got this from Gunderson just now. It's not fancy, but—" He took a deep breath and dropped to one knee. "Daisy Miller, will you marry me? Not because I'm rich, because I'm not anymore, but because I love you more than all the gold in California." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pressed her hands to her mouth. For a terrifying moment, he thought she might refuse. Then she nodded, whispering, "Yes," before repeating more firmly, "Yes, Jackson, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and gathered her into his arms, his heart soaring as she clung to him. "Mrs. Wilson will have my hide for this," Daisy murmured against his chest with a soft laugh. "I'll face her wrath gladly," he replied, drawing back to look into her eyes. "When does the stage leave tomorrow?" 9 o'clock, she answered, her fingers tracing his jawline as if making sure he was real. "Are you certain about this, Jackson, truly certain?" He answered with a kiss, gentle but filled with promise. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Morning came early, with Jackson returning to the boarding house after a night spent making arrangements. Mrs. Wilson insisted on chaperoning their breakfast together in the dining room, her stern presence a reminder of propriety despite their engagement. "So you intend to marry in Boston?" she asked over eggs and coffee. Daisy looked to Jackson, who nodded. "Yes, madam." "Once we arrive and meet Daisy's family, it seemed the proper thing to do." Mrs. Wilson sniffed but seemed appeased by this nod to convention. "And you've given up mining altogether, Mr. Cole?" "Yes, madam. Sold my claim to my partner yesterday." "And what do you intend to do for work in Boston?" Her questions were pointed, but Jackson recognized the protective instinct behind them. "I've saved enough for us to start comfortably," he answered honestly. "And I've worked as a rancher, a carpenter, and a miner. I'm not afraid of hard work, whatever form it takes." "He also reads better than most men I know," Daisy added with pride. "I've taught him myself." Mrs. Wilson's expression softened slightly. "Well, Miss Miller could certainly do worse, though this hasty departure will set tongues wagging." "Let them wag," Daisy replied with uncharacteristic boldness. "We've done nothing improper." The stage was loading when they arrived. Jackson carrying Daisy's 2 trunks while she clutched a smaller valise containing her most precious possessions, books, letters from home, and a daguerreotype of her parents. A small crowd had gathered to see her off, including several of her students who presented her with wildflowers and tearful hugs. "We heard Mr. Cole is going with you, Miss Miller," one little girl said, looking up at Jackson with solemn eyes. "Are you going to marry him?" Daisy blushed but nodded. "Yes, Emma, once we reach Boston and see my family. Then you won't come back to teach us." The disappointment in the child's voice was palpable. Jackson knelt down to the girl's level. "Miss Miller has taught many children here, Emma. Now it's time for her to teach children in another place who need her just as much, but she won't forget any of you." The child considered this, then nodded seriously. "Will you take care of her, Mr. Cole?" "I promise," he said solemnly, "with everything I have." Thomas arrived just as they were boarding, slightly out of breath. "Didn't think you'd leave without saying goodbye, did you?" Jackson embraced his friend. "Thank you for understanding." Thomas pressed something into Jackson's hand, a small leather pouch. "A little extra for your journey." "Don't argue," he added when Jackson began to protest. "Consider it my wedding gift." The stage journey was long and arduous, taking them first to Sacramento, then eastward along the overland route. They faced dust storms, treacherous mountain passes, river crossings, and the constant threat of bandits or hostile encounters. Through it all, Jackson marveled at Daisy's resilience. The refined schoolteacher from Boston endured each hardship with a grace that only made him love her more. At night, when they stopped at way stations or makeshift camps, they would walk a respectable distance from the others, always within sight but finding moments of privacy to talk and dream of their future. "Tell me about your family's ranch in Texas," Daisy asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. Jackson's expression grew wistful. "It wasn't much compared to some, 500 acres of mostly scrubland, good for cattle but not much else. My father worked himself to death trying to make it profitable. My mother followed him a year later. My younger brother James took over, but last I heard he was struggling. Perhaps we could help him," Daisy suggested. "After we're settled." Jackson looked at her in surprise. "You'd consider that?" She took his hand in hers. "Your family is my family now, Jackson, or will be soon enough." He brought her hand to his lips. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "Yes," she smiled, "but I wouldn't mind hearing it again." Their journey took nearly a month, with stops in settlements along the way where they sometimes stayed for a day or two to rest. In a small town in Nebraska, they encountered a traveling preacher who eyed their arrangement with suspicion until Daisy explained they were engaged and traveling to Boston for the wedding. "Why wait?" the preacher asked. "Times are uncertain on the trail. God's blessing shouldn't be delayed by geography." They looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. They had maintained strict propriety throughout their journey, but the preacher's words struck a chord. That evening, with the station manager and his wife as witnesses, they were married in a simple ceremony beside a creek where wildflowers grew in abundance. "I didn't have a proper dress," Daisy fretted after, though she looked beautiful in her best blue traveling dress with flowers in her hair. "You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen," Jackson assured her, his voice thick with emotion. "And now you're Mrs. Cole." They shared their first night as husband and wife in a small private room at the station, a luxury they hadn't been able to afford until now. As Jackson held her in his arms that night, he knew with absolute certainty that no gold mine could have given him the wealth he felt in that moment. The remainder of their journey took on a different quality after that. They no longer had to maintain the pretense of mere traveling companions, though they remained modest in their displays of affection. The other passengers noted the change in their status with knowing smiles, and more than one commented that they made a handsome couple. It was early autumn when they finally arrived in Boston, the city a shock to Jackson's senses after years in mining camps and the open trail. Buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, streets teemed with people, and carriages clattered over cobblestones. He felt out of place in his trail-worn clothes and sun-darkened skin, but Daisy's hand in his was an anchor. "It's overwhelming at first," she assured him, "but you'll grow accustomed to it." Daisy's family home was in a respectable neighborhood of brick townhouses with neat front gardens. She hesitated on the doorstep, suddenly nervous. I should have written ahead, she worried. What if they're not home? What if they don't approve? Jackson squeezed her hand. We've faced bandits and blizzards to get here. We can face your parents. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman whose resemblance to Daisy was unmistakable. Her eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears as she pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. Daisy, oh, my darling girl, we weren't expecting you for another week at least. She drew back, taking in her daughter's appearance, then noticed Jackson standing awkwardly behind her. And who is this gentleman? Daisy took a deep breath. Mother, this is Jackson Cole, my husband. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only when an older man appeared in the hallway behind his wife. Did I hear correctly, husband? The next hours were a whirlwind of explanations, tears both happy and confused, and introductions to siblings who were summoned from various parts of the house. Jackson felt scrutinized from every angle, but he stood tall and answered every question honestly. You were a gold miner. Daisy's father, a successful merchant, asked with thinly veiled skepticism. Yes, sir, for 3 years. And you abandoned a successful claim to follow my daughter. Jackson met the older man's gaze steadily. I discovered something more valuable than gold, sir. I couldn't let her go. Something in his words seemed to reach Daisy's father, whose stern expression softened slightly. Well, you're here now. What do you intend to do in Boston? Mining skills won't serve you here. I'm willing to learn and work at whatever will provide for your daughter, sir. I was a rancher before I was a miner. I know horses, cattle, and how to build. I'm a quick study. After dinner, Daisy's father invited Jackson to his study, a gesture that both honored and terrified the young man. The room was lined with books and smelled of leather and pipe tobacco. Her father poured them each a glass of brandy before settling into a leather chair. You must understand my concerns, he began without preamble. My daughter was sent west to teach, not to find a husband, particularly not one without established prospects. I understand completely, sir, Jackson replied. If I were in your position, I'd have the same concerns. Yet you married her without seeking my blessing. We married on the trail, sir, with a preacher's blessing but not yours, that's true. For that I apologize. But I want you to know that I love your daughter more than my own life, and I will spend every day working to be worthy of her. The older man studied him over the rim of his glass. You gave up gold for her. Yes, sir, and I'd do it again. Why, most men wouldn't. Jackson considered his answer carefully. Because gold is just metal. It can't laugh with you over breakfast or hold your hand when you're sick or build a life of meaning. I realized that what I really wanted wasn't in the ground. It was teaching children to read and standing beside a woman who makes the world better just by being in it. Daisy's father was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once, decisively. I have a friend who manages a livestock yard. They bring cattle in from the west for the Boston market. They could use a man who knows horses and cattle. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest and pays fairly. Jackson's heart leaped. I would be grateful for the opportunity, sir. Understand this, Mr. Cole. I'm doing this for my daughter. You'll have to prove yourself to me. I expect nothing less, sir. The next morning, Jackson accompanied his new father-in-law to the stockyards on the outskirts of Boston. The familiar smells of livestock and hay were comforting amid the strangeness of the city. Jackson removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and set to work alongside the yard hands, demonstrating his knowledge and willingness to tackle even the dirtiest jobs. By day's end, he had earned not only a position but the grudging respect of the yard manager, who commented to Daisy's father, "Your son-in-law's no stranger to hard work, that's plain to see. Most Western men I've met are full of tall tales and little else. This one's different." Jackson returned to the Miller home that evening, exhausted but satisfied. Daisy was waiting, her face anxious until she saw his smile. You got the position? She asked hopefully. I did, starting tomorrow. He took her hands in his. It's not what I imagined doing in Boston, but it's a good start. She rose on tiptoes to kiss him. I'm proud of you. Life settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Jackson worked long hours at the stockyards, coming home tired but fulfilled. Daisy secured a teaching position at a local school, her experience in California giving her an advantage. They moved into a small apartment not far from her parents' home, modest but their own. Their first Christmas together brought snow, something Jackson had rarely seen in California. He watched in childlike wonder as the city was transformed into a white wonderland. Daisy taught him to ice skate on a frozen pond, both of them laughing as he repeatedly lost his balance. "How is it you can ride a half-wild horse but can't stay upright on skates?" She teased, helping him up after a particularly spectacular fall. "Horses make sense," he grumbled good-naturedly. "These contraptions are unnatural." Despite his complaints, he kept trying, determined to master this winter skill that brought such joy to his wife's face. Christmas dinner with the Millers was a formal affair that initially intimidated Jackson, but he found himself welcomed as family. Daisy's siblings had warmed to him over the months, especially her younger brother David, who was fascinated by Jackson's tales of the West. As winter deepened, Jackson found himself missing aspects of California: the milder climate, the open spaces, the sense of possibility that permeated the new state. Boston, for all its civilization and comfort, sometimes felt confining. But then he would look at Daisy, and the momentary homesickness would fade. One snowy evening, as they sat before their small fireplace, Daisy reading aloud while Jackson whittled a toy horse for his nephew's birthday, she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "You miss it, don't you?" she asked, setting down her book. "The West." He looked up, surprised by her perception. "Sometimes," he admitted, "not the mining so much as the openness, the freedom." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been offered a position. Another teaching position here in Boston." She shook her head. "In Kansas territory. They're establishing new settlements and need experienced teachers willing to go west again." Jackson set down his whittling. "Kansas, that's nearly back where we came from, not quite California," she smiled, "but yes, west again." "I haven't given them an answer yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first. What about your family, your position here?" "I love my family, but I spent 2 years away from them before, and the position in Kansas would be as head teacher, establishing a new school." Her eyes lit up with the possibility. "But more importantly, I've seen how you look sometimes out toward the horizon. Boston isn't your home, Jackson. I'm not sure it's mine anymore either." He moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Daisy, I would live anywhere in the world as long as you're with me. If you're happy here, I'm happy with you," she interrupted gently. "And I think we could build something meaningful there, something that's truly ours, not just fitting into the world my parents built." The hope that surged through him must have shown on his face because she laughed and cupped his cheek in her hand. "Should I write to accept the position?" she asked. He answered with a kiss, pulling her close. "Yes," he whispered against her lips. "Let's go west again." The decision made, they spent the next weeks preparing for the journey. Daisy's parents were predictably upset, though her father grudgingly admitted that Jackson had proven himself a dedicated worker and husband. Her mother wept but ultimately gave her blessing, extracting promises of frequent letters. Jackson gave notice at the stockyards, where the manager expressed genuine regret at losing him. "You've got a good head for livestock, Cole. Kansas is cattle country. You might find better opportunities there than hauling hay here." Their journey west in the spring of 1853 was different from their eastward trek. They traveled with more resources, more knowledge, and as a married couple from the start. The Kansas territory that greeted them was a land of rolling prairies and scattered settlements, nothing like the mountains of California or the crowded streets of Boston. The town of Riverdale, where they settled, was little more than a cluster of buildings around a crossroads, but it had ambition. Daisy's school was a simple structure with one room, 16 students of varying ages, and precious few books. Jackson found work initially with a cattle broker, using his knowledge of livestock to help drive herds to market. 6 months after their arrival, an opportunity arose that changed their trajectory. A rancher outside town was selling his property 300 acres with a small house, barn, and good water access. The price was steep but not impossible. especially with the savings they'd accumulated and the small pouch of gold dust Thomas had given them as a wedding gift. "It's not as big as your family's ranch in Texas," Daisy said as they rode the boundaries of the property, considering their decision. "But it could be a start." Jackson looked out over the rolling land, seeing not what was there but what could be. "It's perfect," he said simply. They bought the ranch, naming it Golden Promise, a nod to what Jackson had left behind and what they were building together. The first years were hard, with drought one season and flooding the next. They expanded slowly, adding cattle each year, improving the house room by room. Daisy continued teaching while helping with the ranch, her determination matching Jackson's. She started a small lending library in town, bringing books from her own collection and writing to connections in Boston for more. In their third year in Kansas, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Emma after the little girl in California who had asked Jackson to take care of her teacher. As their family grew, Emma followed by James 2 years later, then Catherine 3 years after that. So did their ranch and their standing in the community. Jackson's knowledge of cattle breeding and fair dealing earned him respect among the other ranchers. Daisy's educational initiatives made Riverdale known as a town that valued learning as well as hard work. Letters arrived occasionally from California. Thomas had developed their claim successfully, becoming a wealthy man who eventually moved to San Francisco and invested in shipping. He visited them once, marveling at what they'd built. "You know, you could have had twice this much if you'd stayed," he commented as they rode the boundaries of Golden Promise, now expanded to nearly 1,000 acres. Jackson looked back toward the ranch house, where Daisy was teaching Emma to make bread on the porch, flour dusting both their faces as they laughed together. James was attempting to help, his small hands creating more mess than progress. "No," Jackson said with absolute certainty. "I couldn't have." 10 years after leaving the goldfields, Jackson stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Kansas prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The house had grown along with their family, now 6 children strong with the addition of twins Michael and Matthew, and little Rose, just learning to walk. Daisy joined him, slipping her arm around his waist as she followed his gaze to the horizon. At 35, she was more beautiful to him than ever, her face lined with a decade of laughter and occasional tears, her hands strong from work but gentle when needed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, "leaving the gold behind?" He turned to her, taking in the face he'd woken up to for 10 years, the smile that still made his heart race. "Not for a single moment, even when the cattle prices fell last year or when the roof leaked all winter before that," he laughed, pulling her closer. "Even then. Some men spend their whole lives chasing gold and never find what I have right here." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I found my fortune too, you know. A man who would choose love over gold isn't common in any territory." Inside, they could hear their children laughing, the older ones helping the younger with evening chores. The ranch hands were settling the horses for the night, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. "We should go in," Daisy said after a while. "The children will be waiting for their story." Jackson nodded but didn't move immediately, savoring the moment. "You know what Thomas told me before we left California? He said not to come crying back when I was poor and married with 6 children. Daisy laughed. "He was right about the 6 children part, but wrong about the poor part," Jackson finished. "I've never been richer." He kissed her then, there on the porch of the home they'd built together as the last golden light faded from the prairie sky. Behind them, their oldest daughter called that supper was ready, and they turned together toward the warm light spilling from the windows of their home. Years continued to pass, bringing changes both expected and surprising. The Civil War touched even their corner of Kansas, though they were far from the worst fighting. Jackson, too old to enlist at 40, instead helped organize supply lines and shelter for refugees. Daisy's school became a haven for children displaced by the conflict. Their children grew. Emma, thoughtful and determined like her mother, became a teacher herself. James, who had his father's affinity for livestock and open spaces, took on more responsibility at Golden Promise. Catherine developed an unexpected talent for business, helping to expand their cattle operation into neighboring territories. The twins, different as night and day despite their identical appearance, found their own paths. Michael as a doctor after studying in St. Louis, Matthew as a lawyer helping to establish property rights as the territory became more settled. Little Rose, the baby of the family, showed a gift for music that brightened their home. Through it all, Jackson and Daisy remained each other's constants. Their love deepened with each challenge overcome, each joy shared. They weathered drought and prosperity, illness and health, always together. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration that brought together the entire community. The small church in Riverdale could barely contain the well-wishers who came to honor the couple who had helped shape the town. James had arranged a special surprise, unveiled after the feasting and speeches. He led his parents outside to where a photographer had set up his equipment, a rare luxury in their part of Kansas. "We want a portrait," he explained, "something for all of us to keep." As they posed, Jackson and Daisy seated in the center, their children and growing number of grandchildren arranged around them, the photographer asked them to hold still and look happy. "That's the easiest instruction I've ever been given," Jackson murmured to Daisy, taking her hand in his. The resulting photograph captured them perfectly. Jackson still straight-backed despite his 60 years, his hair now silver but his eyes still bright. Daisy beside him, her face lined with years of sunshine and smiles, her hand clasped firmly in his, their family surrounding them like the fulfillment of a promise made long ago. That night, after the celebrations had ended and their guests had departed, Jackson and Daisy stood once more on their porch, a habit of 25 years. "Do you remember what you said to me that night in Mrs. Wilson's parlor?" Daisy asked. "When you came to tell me you were leaving the goldfields," Jackson smiled, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. "I said I didn't want gold, I wanted a life that meant something." She turned to him, her eyes shining in the lamplight spilling from their home. "You've built that life, Jackson, we both have." He gathered her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, now streaked with gray, "and it's worth more than all the gold in California." Inside their home, a grandchild cried softly, and one of their daughters began singing a lullaby. Cattle lowed in the distant pastures. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods they'd planted when they first arrived. "Should we go in?" Daisy asked after a while. Jackson nodded but held her hand to keep her beside him for just a moment longer. "I've been thinking about Thomas," he said. "About what he might have found with all that gold. And I hope he found something that made him as happy as your smile has made me." She rose on tiptoes to kiss him, a gesture unchanged by 25 years. "Come to bed, Cowboy. Tomorrow's another day at Golden Promise." Hand in hand, they walked inside, closing the door against the night as they had done countless times before, two people who had discovered that the greatest fortune wasn't found in the ground, but in each other. As the years continued to pass, Golden Promise Ranch flourished under the shared management of Jackson, Daisy, and their growing family. Their grandchildren, eventually numbering 15, filled the expanded ranch house with laughter and energy that kept Jackson and Daisy young at heart, even as their bodies began to show their age. In 1879, nearly 30 years after Jackson had covered up his gold claim, they received an unexpected letter. Thomas, Jackson's old mining partner, had passed away in San Francisco. To their surprise, his will contained a bequest for them, a substantial sum with a note that read simply, "For the man who knew the true value of things before I did." The inheritance allowed them to establish a proper school building in Riverdale, replacing the one-room structure where Daisy had taught for so many years. They named it Thomas Miller Academy, honoring both their benefactor and Daisy's maiden name. The school became known throughout the region for its quality education, drawing students from neighboring communities. Jackson, approaching 70 but still active in ranch operations, would sometimes visit the school to tell the children stories of the California Gold Rush and the early days of Kansas Territory. The students were particularly fascinated by the tale of how he had abandoned a fortune in gold for love. "Would you really have been rich, Mr. Cole?" one young boy asked during such a visit. Jackson glanced at Daisy, who was arranging books on a shelf across the classroom, her movements still graceful despite her 68 years. "I am rich, son," he replied with a smile, "just not in the way most people measure it." When their 50th wedding anniversary arrived in 1903, much had changed in the world around them. The frontier they had helped to settle was now crisscrossed by railroads and telegraph lines. Automobiles had begun to appear even in their remote corner of Kansas. Their children had children of their own, some now grown with families of their own. Golden Promise Ranch, now primarily managed by James and his sons, had become one of the most respected cattle operations in the state. Catherine had expanded their interests to include a small bank in Riverdale that helped local farmers and ranchers weather the economic uncertainties of the new century. For their anniversary celebration, all 6 of their children insisted on bringing their families to Golden Promise, no matter the distance. For a week, the ranch teemed with 4 generations of Coles, from Jackson and Daisy down to their newest great-grandchild, just 3 months old. On the evening of their anniversary, Jackson found himself momentarily alone on the porch, watching the familiar Kansas sunset. Despite his 80 years, his mind remained sharp, filled with memories of a life well lived. He heard the door open behind him and knew without turning that it was Daisy. After 50 years, he could recognize her footsteps, the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle scent that was uniquely hers. "There you are," she said, joining him at the railing. "The grandchildren are looking for you. Matthew's oldest wants another story about the gold rush." Jackson chuckled. "I've told those stories so many times I'm not sure what's memory and what's embellishment anymore." "They love them regardless," Daisy said, slipping her arm through his. Her hair was completely white now, her face deeply lined, but her eyes still held the warmth and intelligence that had captured his heart half a century before. 50 years, he marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I rode into Riverview to find you at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house. And sometimes it feels like we've always been here," she finished. "As if Golden Promise has always been our home." Inside, they could hear their family gathering for the evening celebration, voices calling, children laughing, music starting. The sounds of the life they had built together. "We should go in," Jackson said, but made no move to do so. Daisy understood, as she always had. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the colors fade from the sky as they had done countless times before. "Jackson," she said after a while, her voice soft but clear, "if you could go back to that day at the claim, knowing everything that would come after, would you make the same choice?" He turned to look at her fully, taking in the face he had loved through youth and middle age and now into their twilight years. "In a heartbeat," he said without hesitation. "The only regret I've ever had was that I almost didn't make that choice, that I almost let you leave without me." She smiled, the expression lighting her face in a way that still made his heart skip. "I think I would have come back for you, you know. If you hadn't come to me that night, I couldn't have left my heart behind in California." "I'm glad we didn't have to find out," he said, bending to kiss her with the tenderness of 50 years' practice. A chorus of cheers and applause erupted behind them, and they turned to find their entire family watching from the doorway and windows. 50 years and they still can't keep their hands off each other," James called good-naturedly, causing laughter to ripple through the gathering. Jackson grinned, unembarrassed. "When you find a treasure worth more than gold, you don't let it go," he called back, drawing Daisy closer to his side. The celebration that followed was filled with music, stories, and expressions of love from 3 generations who owed their existence to a decision made in the California goldfields. As midnight approached, Emma, their eldest, raised a toast. "To our parents," she said, her voice carrying across the crowded room, "who taught us all that the greatest treasures in life aren't found in the ground but in each other's hearts. May we all be wise enough to recognize true wealth when we see it." To Jackson and Daisy, the family echoed, glasses raised. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the room that had been theirs for nearly 5 decades, Daisy paused before the small, framed photograph on their dresser, the portrait taken on their 25th anniversary, now joined by others documenting their family's growth. "We've been blessed," she said softly. Jackson came to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "Beyond measure," he agreed. As they had every night for 50 years, they said their prayers together before lying down side by side, their hands finding each other in the familiar darkness. "Good night, my love," Daisy whispered. "Good night, my treasure," Jackson replied, the words a ritual that had never lost their meaning. The years continued their relentless march. The world entered a new century, bringing automobiles to the roads near Golden Promise and telephones to connect them with their far-flung family members. The Great War touched them through grandsons who served and, in two heartbreaking cases, did not return. Jackson and Daisy faced these changes and sorrows together, their bond unbroken by time or circumstance. When Jackson's health began to fail in his 86th year, Daisy was his constant companion, reading to him when his eyesight dimmed, helping him to the porch on good days so he could still watch the sunsets over the land they had loved. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," he said one evening as she helped him back to bed after a difficult day. "Hush," she admonished gently. 57 years ago, you chose me over a fortune. Allow me the honor of choosing you each day now, whatever that entails." He smiled weakly, reaching for her hand. "I'm still getting the better end of that bargain." In the spring of 1910, as the first wildflowers bloomed across the Kansas prairie, Jackson Cole passed peacefully in his sleep, Daisy's hand still clasped in his. He was 87 years old. The funeral brought together not only their extensive family, but much of the community that had grown around Golden Promise. The small church overflowed with those whose lives had been touched by the man who had once been a gold miner, then a rancher, but always, fundamentally, a man who understood what truly mattered. James spoke of his father's wisdom and work ethic. Emmer recalled his storytelling and gentle guidance. Their grandchildren shared memories of fishing trips and riding lessons. Former students from Daisy's school, now grown with children of their own, remembered his visits and the way he had made history come alive for them. Through it all, Daisy sat with quiet dignity, surrounded by her family, her grief tempered by the knowledge of a life well and fully lived. After the others had gone, she stood alone by the fresh grave, the Kansas wind gently stirring her white hair. "I'll be along soon, my love," she whispered. "But there are a few things I need to finish first." True to her nature, Daisy channeled her grief into purpose. She completed the memoir she and Jackson had been writing together, documenting not just their own story but the settlement and growth of their community. She continued to be involved in the school that bore her maiden name, and she cherished every moment with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. 2 years after Jackson's passing, on a golden autumn afternoon, Daisy followed him. Their children found her in her favorite chair on the porch, a peaceful expression on her face, and an old, worn book of poetry in her lap, the same book she had given Jackson when teaching him to read better, all those years ago in California. They were laid to rest side by side, beneath a simple headstone that read Jackson and Daisy Cole, who found true gold in each other, 1827, 1910, 1835, 1912, the story of the cowboy who rode away from the gold fields, choosing a schoolteacher's smile over fortune, became a family legend passed down through generations. As the 20th century progressed, bringing unprecedented changes to the world, the descendants of Jackson and Daisy Cole continued to farm and ranch the land of Golden Promise, guided by the values their ancestors had embodied. In 1952, 100 years after Jackson's fateful decision, the family gathered at Golden Promise to commemorate the centennial. By then, the original ranch had grown into a substantial operation, and the Cole family had expanded into business, education, politics, and the arts across America. Among those present was a young historian, the great-grandson of Jackson and Daisy, who had recently discovered something remarkable in the California State Archives, the original claim record for Jackson's abandoned mine, along with documents showing that Thomas had indeed developed it into one of the most productive operations of the later Gold Rush period. He really did walk away from a fortune, the young man told his assembled relatives, showing them the figures. By today's standards, it would be worth millions. An elderly woman, one of Daisy and Jackson's granddaughters, smiled at this revelation. And yet, she said softly, if you asked any of us if we would trade our existence for that gold, what do you think the answer would be? The gathering fell silent, contemplating the chain of decisions and devotion that had led to their presence in that moment. Around them, Golden Promise Ranch stretched toward the horizon, a living testament to what could grow from choosing love over gold. As the sun set on that centennial celebration, casting the Kansas prairie in shades of amber and gold, the family of Jackson and Daisy Cole stood together on the porch of the ranch house, now expanded and modernized, but still standing on its original foundation. They watched the sky transform, just as their ancestors had done for decades, and felt the enduring truth of a decision made a century before, that the most valuable treasures aren't found in the ground, but in the hearts and lives of those we love. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of a former gold miner and a determined schoolteacher looked on with satisfaction, knowing that their legacy of love had proven more enduring than any vein of precious metal could ever be.